Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a cup of tea, because today we are going to journey back in time, past the marble columns and grand triumphs, to unravel the intimate and often brutal reality of love and marriage in ancient Rome. Love, the emotion we cherish, was a secondary consideration, a potential bonus but never the foundation. The foundation was pietas, duty to family, to the state, and to the gods, a far colder, heavier stone. In our exploration of Roman marriage, it's crucial to avoid the trap of viewing Roman women solely as victims. While they were constrained by a deeply patriarchal system, many navigated it with skill, intelligence, and resilience. They were not passive pawns. They were active agents within their limited spheres. They managed large households, raised and educated future leaders, used their social networks to their family's advantage, and as we've seen, could exert considerable indirect influence. To truly appreciate the day-to-day reality for a Roman wife, we must understand the immense importance of the household slaves. In any reasonably well-off family, the matrona would not be performing manual labor herself. Instead, she was a manager, a commander of a domestic army. Her day would begin with assigning tasks to the slaves responsible for cleaning, cooking, and shopping. The raising of children was, of course, a central part of the Roman wife's existence, but it was fraught with a unique blend of emotional investment and societal expectation. While a mother's love was undoubtedly a real and powerful force, her ultimate goal was to mold her children into ideal Romans. She was the first and most important teacher of mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. For her sons, this meant instilling the virtues of courage, gravity, and duty to the state. The concept of companionship in Roman marriage is a subtle but important one. While passion was viewed with suspicion, the ideal of a harmonious partnership was highly valued. Cicero, writing about marriage, speaks of a community of life, a partnership where husband and wife share in all things, divine and human. This ideal went beyond mere procreation and household management. It implied a level of friendship, mutual respect, and shared purpose. The Augustan marriage laws, enacted around 18 BC, represent a pivotal moment where the state dramatically intervened in the private lives of its citizens. Emperor Augustus, concerned by the low birth rates among the Roman elite and what he saw as their moral laxity, enacted a series of laws to encourage marriage and procreation. These laws were unprecedented in their scope. They penalized unmarried men and childless couples through inheritance restrictions. The brutal reality for a woman accused of adultery under Augustus's laws cannot be overstated. Before these laws, adultery was a private family matter, to be dealt with by the paterfamilias or the husband. Augustus made it a public crime. If a husband discovered his wife's infidelity, he was legally required to divorce her and bring her to trial in a special court. If he failed to do so, he himself could be prosecuted for pimping. In this environment of strict rules and public scrutiny, how did Romans express affection in their daily lives? While grand romantic gestures might have been rare or viewed with suspicion, small, private moments of tenderness certainly existed. A shared meal, a quiet conversation in the peristyle garden, a gift of a piece of jewelry or a book. These were the ways affection could be shown. Inscriptions sometimes mention a couple's shared jokes or pet names, offering tiny windows into their intimate world. The figure of the concubine, or concubina, occupies a unique and often misunderstood place in Roman society. A concubine was a woman in a long-term monogamous relationship with a man she could not legally marry, often due to differences in social status. For instance, a senator could not marry a freedwoman. A concubinage was not a casual affair. It was a recognized and socially accepted domestic partnership. The life of a Roman soldier's wife or partner presents another facet of this reality. For much of the Principate period, common soldiers were legally forbidden from marrying while in service. This was a practical measure to ensure the mobility and discipline of the legions. However, this ban did not stop soldiers from forming long-term relationships with local women in the provinces where they were stationed. The topic of infertility was a source of great anxiety and personal tragedy in Roman marriage. In a society that prized children above all, a childless couple faced social pressure and a sense of failure. Since the primary purpose of marriage was procreation, barrenness was a legitimate and common reason for a man to divorce his wife. Medical knowledge was limited, and the blame was almost always placed on the woman. For a Roman man, fidelity was a flexible concept, a street with many paths leading away from the home. For a woman, it was a narrow, guarded bridge, and to fall from it was to fall into ruin or even death. Let's consider the role of in-laws, particularly the mother-in-law. The Roman bride in a cum manu marriage entered her husband's home and came under the authority of his paterfamilias. She also entered a household that was likely managed by her mother-in-law, the established matrona of the house. This could create a very difficult dynamic. The young bride would have to learn the ways of a new family, under the watchful and potentially critical eye of an older, more powerful woman. The economic life of a woman who became legally independent, or sui iuris, is a story of both opportunity and constraint. A wealthy widow or a woman from a rich family whose father had died could control a significant fortune. The historical record shows us women who owned and managed vast agricultural estates, shipping businesses, and brick factories. They were active economic agents, lending money, investing, and managing their properties through agents and stewards. The contrast between city life and country life for a Roman wife would have been stark. A wealthy woman in the city of Rome was at the center of the social and political world. Her life was filled with managing a complex household, social calls, and attending dinners and public spectacles. She was part of a vibrant, if rigid, social scene. A woman living on a large country estate, a villa, would have had a very different existence. The use of poison is a dark and recurring theme in Roman historical accounts of domestic life, reflecting the high stakes and hidden tensions within the family. Accusations of poisoning were not uncommon, particularly against women. A wife who stood to inherit a fortune, a stepmother who wanted her own son to be the heir, or a woman who simply wanted to be free of an unwanted husband. These were common tropes in Roman literature and court cases. Let's examine the end of a Roman marriage through death, focusing on the funeral rites. When a prominent Roman died, the funeral was a major public event, a final performance of the family's status and honor. The deceased would be laid out in the atrium, their feet pointing toward the door. The emotional toll of the Roman system on men is also worth considering. While men held the power, they were also trapped in the system's expectations. The pressure on a man to secure a suitable heir, to maintain the family's honor, and to live up to the stoic ideal of an unemotional, authoritative patriarch must have been immense. A man who genuinely loved his wife but was forced to divorce her because she was barren would have experienced real grief. The religious life of a Roman matron was a key part of her identity. While the major state cults were dominated by male priests, the home was her sacred domain. She was responsible for the daily worship of the household gods, the Lares who protected the home, the Penates who guarded the storeroom, and Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. Every day, she would lead the family in making small offerings of food and wine at the household shrine, the lararium. We can learn a great deal from the things that Roman moralists complained about. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca, the younger, frequently decried what they saw as the decline of traditional marriage. They complained about women becoming too educated, too independent, and too interested in unladylike pursuits like philosophy or sports. They satirized women who dominated their husbands, spent lavishly on luxuries, and were unfaithful. The brutal reality of love and marriage was not uniform across the vast Roman Empire. A woman living in Roman Egypt, for example, might have had a very different experience from a woman in Rome or Gaul. In Egypt, which had its own long history of relatively high status for women, local traditions often blended with Roman law. The concept of reputation, or fama, was a powerful, intangible force in Roman life. For a woman, her reputation was her most precious asset and her greatest vulnerability. A good reputation built on perceived chastity, modesty, and domesticity was essential for a good marriage and for maintaining her family's honor. But this reputation was fragile. It could be destroyed by a single rumor, a misplaced glance, or an unfounded accusation. Consider the silence in the marriage bed, where one partner's pleasure is paramount and the other's is an afterthought, a footnote in the grand story of procreation and the continuation of the family name. Let's reconsider the wedding gift. While the dowry was the main financial transaction, other gifts were exchanged. The groom would often give his bride a gift on the morning after the wedding. More importantly, the couple would receive gifts from friends and family. These were not just tokens of affection. They were part of the complex social web of reciprocity that bound Roman society together. Giving a gift created a social obligation. The transition to Christianity in the later Roman Empire brought profound changes to the institution of marriage. While the early Christians were a small, often persecuted sect, their ideas about love, marriage, and sexuality would eventually transform the Roman world. Christianity elevated marriage to a sacred sacrament, a holy union ordained by God. It preached a new ideal of sexual morality, condemning divorce, which had been common in Roman society, and championing lifelong monogamy. However, the Christianization of the empire did not lead to a golden age of equality in marriage. In many ways, it reinforced the patriarchal structure with divine authority. The church fathers, like Tertullian and Augustine, were often deeply suspicious of female sexuality, viewing women as daughters of Eve, sources of temptation. While they forbade divorce, this could also trap women in abusive or unhappy marriages with no way out. The archaeological record provides a silent, poignant counterpoint to the written texts of the elite. The excavation of ordinary homes in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum gives us a glimpse into the material world of Roman families. We see the small kitchens where meals were prepared, the simple bedrooms, the household shrines where daily prayers were offered. We find everyday objects, cooking pots, loom weights, children's toys, and simple jewelry. The story of love and marriage in ancient Rome is ultimately a story about power. It's about the absolute power of the paterfamilias, the legal power of the husband, the social power of reputation and gossip, and the economic power of the dowry. It's about the state's power to regulate private life for its own ends. As we come to the end of our journey, it is clear that the phrase Roman romance is largely a modern invention. The reality was something far more complex, pragmatic, and, yes, brutal. It was an institution designed not for the personal fulfillment of the individual, but for the stability and continuation of the collective, the family, the bloodline, and the state. The rights and desires of the individual, especially the female individual, were secondary to these larger goals. Let us explore in greater detail the life of a freedwoman, a liberta, as her experience of love and marriage existed in a unique social space. A slave freed by her master, she gained citizenship but not full social equality. Often, a male slave owner would free his female slave in order to marry her, a relationship known as a patron-client marriage. In this arrangement, he was not just her husband but also her patron, and she, as his client, owed him deference and certain duties. The wedding contract, or tabulae nuptials, was an important document, especially for the elite. While not legally required for the marriage to be valid, it was a practical necessity. This written document laid out the financial terms of the union, with the most important clause being the detailed inventory and valuation of the dowry. It would specify the conditions for the dowry's return in the event of divorce or death. These contracts were businesslike and unsentimental. The ideal of the univira, the one-man woman, deserves deeper consideration because of its powerful ideological weight. This wasn't just about a widow remaining single. It was about a woman whose entire sexual and marital life was dedicated to one man alone. This ideal was celebrated on tombstones and praised by moralists as the absolute pinnacle of female virtue. Why was this so important? Because it represented the ultimate containment of female sexuality. The role of public opinion and gossip in policing marriage cannot be overemphasized. In the small, interconnected world of the Roman elite, everyone knew everyone else's business. A woman's behavior was under constant observation, not just by her family, but by her neighbors, her social rivals, and the public at large. A rumor of an indiscretion, even if untrue, could be ruinous. A child is born, but its first breath does not guarantee its life. It is laid at its father's feet, and only if he lifts the infant does it officially join the family. If not, the cold reality of exposure awaits. Let us revisit the concept of patria potestas in the context of an adult son's marriage. Imagine a successful Roman general in his 40s, a man who commands legions and governs provinces. If his father is still alive, that general legally owns nothing. The house he lives in, the slaves who serve him, even the salary he earns from the state, all of it belongs to his paterfamilias. When he marries, the dowry his wife brings is given not to him, but to his father. The concept of the illegitimate child, spurious, carried a heavy and lifelong stigma in Roman society. A child born outside of a legally recognized marriage had almost no rights. They could not inherit from their father, they were not part of his lineage, and they could not claim his family name. They were outsiders. This stark legal reality is the ultimate explanation for the obsession with female chastity within marriage. The imperial women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty provide some of the most dramatic and brutal examples of marriage as a political tool. Augustus married his only daughter, Julia, off 3 times to secure his plans for succession. First to his nephew Marcellus, then to his loyal general Agrippa, and finally to his stepson Tiberius. By all accounts, her final marriage to Tiberius was deeply unhappy for both of them. The legal status of women as witnesses in court further illustrates their diminished public standing. While not absolutely barred, a woman's testimony was generally considered less reliable than a man's. Legal sources often reflect a deep-seated prejudice, suggesting that women were more emotional, less rational, and more susceptible to influence than men. As such, their evidence was given less weight. The symbolism of wool working, or lanificium, is a thread that runs through the entire identity of the Roman matron. From the bride's woolen girdle to the constant praise of making wool on tombstones, this activity was more than just a domestic chore. It was a powerful symbol of traditional Roman virtue. In a world of increasing luxury and imported goods, the image of the matron at her loom harkened back to a simpler, more virtuous past. Let's consider the emotional world of a Roman boy as he was prepared for his future role as a husband in paterfamilias. From a young age, he was taught to suppress overt emotion and to cultivate a demeanor of gravitas, or dignified self-control. His relationship with his own father was likely formal and based on a model of authority and obedience. The Roman dinner party, or convivium, was a key social arena where marital dynamics were on display. In the early Republic, respectable women were not typically present at such parties. By the late Republic and Empire, however, it was common for the wives of the host and guests to attend. But their participation was circumscribed. They reclined on chairs, while the men reclined on couches. They were expected to be witty and charming, but not overly forward or opinionated. The legal concept of the dowry's return, the actio rei uxoriae, was one of the most significant legal protections a Roman woman had. This was the lawsuit a woman or her family could bring against her ex-husband to recover her dowry. Roman law was quite clear that the dowry was intended for the burdens of marriage, and if the marriage ended, it should, in principle, be returned. However, the law allowed the husband to make deductions under certain circumstances. What if a Roman man did not want to marry? For the upper classes, this was not really an option, especially after Augustus. The state and the family demanded marriage and children. A man who remained a bachelor was seen as selfish, shirking his duty to the state and his ancestors. The Augustan laws explicitly penalized the unmarried, making it difficult for them to inherit property. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth was a time of great danger for a Roman woman. With no understanding of modern germ theory and limited medical knowledge, the process was fraught with risk. Postpartum infections were common and often fatal. A host of goddesses were invoked for protection during labor, a sign of the deep anxiety surrounding the event. Midwives, or obstetrics, were the primary caregivers, and their skill could mean the difference between life and death. Divorce was often as simple as a spoken phrase, an unceremonious dismissal. Take your things and go. A life could be upended in a moment, a woman sent back to her birth family, her purpose in that household extinguished. The adoption system in Rome was a fascinating and uniquely Roman institution that reveals their pragmatic approach to family. Adoption, or adoptio, was not primarily about providing a home for a needy child. It was a legal tool used by the elite to ensure the continuation of a family line when no natural son was born. A wealthy, childless man would adopt an adult male from another family to become his legal son and heir. This was a purely strategic decision. The Roman perception of stepmothers, or noverchi, was overwhelmingly negative. In literature and popular imagination, the stepmother was a stock villain, cruel, scheming, and a threat to her stepchildren. She was often suspected of favoring her own children and of trying to disinherit her stepchildren to secure the family fortune for her own offspring. The most sinister accusation was that of poisoning. The role of the wedding ring in Roman marriage was different from our modern symbolism. The earliest Roman ring was made of plain iron, a symbol not of love, but of a binding, unbreakable contract. It was worn on the fourth finger of the left hand because the Romans believed a nerve ran directly from this finger to the heart, the vena amoris. Even in this, we see a blend of practical contract and a hint of sentiment. By the time of the empire, wealthier Romans exchanged gold rings. Let us consider the final words on a Roman tombstone, the epitaph. These inscriptions offer a curated, idealized glimpse into Roman marriage. They were composed after death, designed to present the deceased and their family in the best possible light to the public. As such, they are a form of performance. A husband praising his wife as chaste, obedient, and a good mother was also praising himself for having chosen and managed such a virtuous spouse. The physical appearance of the Roman matrona was a statement of her status. Her signature garment was the stola, a long, sleeveless tunic worn over another tunic. It was the exclusive dress of a respectable married woman, a citizen's wife. A prostitute was forbidden from wearing it, forced instead to wear a man's toga. The stola was a public marker of respectability and marital status. It visually separated the chaste wife from other women. The absence of a concept of marital rape in Roman law is one of its most brutal features from a modern perspective. The law simply did not recognize the possibility. A wife was legally obligated to be available to her husband for the purpose of procreation. Her body, in this sense, was part of the marital contract. The famous jurist Ulpian stated that the law did not prosecute a man for raping his wife because marriage implied a kind of lifelong consent. The influence of Stoic philosophy on the Roman ideal of marriage, particularly among the elite, offered a more humane, if still unequal, vision. Stoic philosophers like Seneca and Musonius Rufus argued that the ideal marriage should be a partnership of rational equals based on friendship, companionship, and mutual support. Musonius Rufus, unusually for his time, argued that women should receive the same philosophical education as men. The social life of a Roman woman was largely dictated by her husband's career and status. The wife of a senator would be part of a very different social circle from the wife of a merchant or a craftsman. Her friendships would be with women of a similar class. A significant part of her social duty was to support her husband's career through her own networks. The friendships she cultivated with other matrons could be a valuable source of information and influence for her husband. The legal concept of guardianship for women, or tutela mulierum, is another clear indicator of their subordinate status. Even if a woman was sui iuris, not under the power of a paterfamilias or a husband, she was, for much of Roman history, required to have a legal guardian, a tutor. This tutor's approval was needed for her to perform certain major legal acts, such as selling land, making a will, or entering into a major contract. Let us look at the Roman home not just as a space, but as a soundscape. What would a Roman marriage have sounded like? It would have been filled with the sounds of authority, the master giving orders to his slaves, the matron directing the household. It would have held the sounds of labor, the rhythmic clatter of the loom, the grinding of grain, the bustle of the kitchen. It would have been filled with the cries and laughter of children, a sound made precious by the constant threat of their loss. We see tender words on tombstones, epitaphs for a dearest wife, a sweetest companion. These glimpses of affection are real, but they are flickering candles in the vast, often cold structure of Roman marital law. Ultimately, the brutal reality of Roman marriage was its inherent lack of choice. For the vast majority of Romans, particularly women, marriage was not a choice one made, but a destiny one fulfilled. A girl did not choose if or when she would marry. She did not choose her partner. She did not choose the terms of her life's primary role. This path was laid out for her by her family and her society from the moment of her birth. One of the most telling aspects of the Roman system is how it dealt with a wife's property outside of the dowry. This was known as paterfamilias. In a sine manu marriage, any property a woman owned or inherited that was not part of her dowry remained entirely her own. She could manage it, sell it, or bequeath it as she saw fit, though she might need the formal approval of her guardian for major transactions. This gave wealthy women a significant degree of economic independence. The Roman attitude toward romantic love as portrayed in literature is a fascinating paradox. On one hand, you have the epic poetry of Virgil, which champions Pieta's duty over love, as seen in Aeneas's abandonment of Dido. This represents the official, state-sanctioned view. On the other hand, you have the elegiac poets like Catullus, Propertius, and Ovid, who wrote almost exclusively about passionate, often tormented, and illicit love affairs. Consider the brutal reality for a woman who could not provide a dowry. In a society where marriage was fundamentally an economic transaction, a poor, free-born woman was at a severe disadvantage. Without a dowry, she had little to offer a prospective husband from a respectable family. This could lead to several outcomes. She might marry a man of a similarly low status, where the marriage was more about a partnership of labor for survival than a formal contract. The role of festivals and public games provided a rare opportunity for social mixing and a temporary release from the strictures of daily life. But even these were fraught with rules. Ovid, in his Art of Love, cheekily advises men on how to pick up women at the Circus Maximus or in the theater. While this is poetic license, it points to the fact that these public spectacles were one of the few places where men and women could interact with a degree of freedom. The Roman legal system's treatment of inheritance further highlights the patriarchal structure. The primary goal of Roman inheritance law was to keep property within the male line of the family. Sons were the primary heirs. Daughters could inherit, but their share was often smaller, and their inheritance was frequently channeled into their dowries. A will was a powerful tool for the Paterfamilias. He could use it to reward loyal children and disinherit those who had displeased him. The concept of modesty, pudicitia, was perhaps the single most important virtue for a Roman woman. It was a broad concept that encompassed not just her sexual chastity, but her entire demeanor. It meant being modest in her dress, her speech, and her public behavior. She should avert her gaze in the presence of men who were not her relatives. She should not be loud or boisterous. She should not drink wine. Pudicitia was the bedrock of her reputation and her family's honor. Let us explore the world of Roman medicine as it related to women. Roman medical writers like Soranus of Ephesus wrote extensively on gynecology, but their understanding was based on a flawed and male-centric view of the female body. They saw the female anatomy primarily through the lens of its procreative function. Many medical theories were based on the idea of the wandering womb, the belief that the uterus could move around the body, causing various ailments. The life of a Vestal virgin presents a fascinating and unique alternative to marriage for a select few. Chosen in childhood from noble families, these 6 priestesses dedicated 30 years of their lives to serving the goddess Vesta and tending her sacred flame, which was believed to ensure the safety of Rome. During their service, they were sworn to absolute chastity. The penalty for breaking this vow was terrifying: to be buried alive. Let's consider the brutal reality of old age for a Roman woman, particularly if she was a widow without family support. While a wealthy widow could be independent, a poor one faced a grim future. With no husband to provide for her and perhaps no sons, she could fall into destitution. The Roman state had no formal system of social security or welfare for the elderly. Support was a family responsibility. The wife was the guardian of the hearth, the keeper of the keys, the weaver of wool. These were her symbols of power, but they were symbols of a domestic sphere from which she could rarely escape into public life. The Roman concept of jealousy is revealing. A husband's jealousy was seen as a natural and justifiable response to a threat to his property and honor. He had the right to be jealous, and this jealousy could be a pretext for controlling his wife's behavior, restricting her movements and scrutinizing her friendships. A wife's jealousy, on the other hand, was viewed very differently. The physical layout of the Roman marital bed, the lectus genialis, offers its own symbolic insights. It was a special, often elaborately decorated couch, placed in the atrium on the wedding day as a symbol of the new union. After the wedding, it was moved to the couple's bedroom, the cubiculum. This room was typically small, dark, and sparsely furnished. It was a private space, but its purpose was not primarily one of romantic intimacy. It was the functional space for producing heirs. How did the massive expansion of the Roman Empire affect the institution of marriage back in Rome? The influx of unimaginable wealth and vast numbers of slaves from conquered territories had a profound impact, especially on the elite. This new wealth led to a rise in luxury, and what moralists saw as a decline in traditional virtues. Dowries became larger, and divorces, especially among the political class, became more frequent and more scandalous as alliances shifted. The concept of arranged marriage is central to this entire discussion, but it is vital to understand the Roman perspective on it. To a Roman, the idea of two young, inexperienced people choosing their own life partners based on a fleeting emotion like love would have seemed incredibly foolish and irresponsible. Marriage was too important to be left to chance. It was the foundation of the family, and the family was the foundation of the state. The emotional expression in Roman letters gives us some of our most intimate glimpses into marital relationships. When Cicero was in exile, his letters to his wife Terentia are filled with anxiety and deep affection. He calls her light of my life and most faithful and best of wives. He worries for her safety and praises her courage in managing their affairs in his absence. This correspondence reveals a true partnership. However, their story also has a brutal ending. Let's consider the role of humor and satire. Roman writers like Juvenal and Martial used their wit to mercilessly mock the institution of marriage and the behavior of both husbands and wives. They wrote about legacy-hunting husbands who married rich old widows and domineering wives who bossed around their meek husbands. They satirized women who spent all day on cosmetics and men who were jealous fools. The transition from a republic to an empire under Augustus had a profound psychological impact on the Roman elite and their family lives. In the Republic, the goal of a noble family was to produce sons who would compete for the highest offices and bring glory to the family name. With the emperor now holding supreme power, the avenues for traditional political ambition were shut down. The purpose of marriage shifted. The Roman legal system's view on domestic disputes is telling. The state was generally very reluctant to interfere in what happened within the walls of the domus. The Paterfamilias was the lawgiver and the judge in his own home. Only in the most extreme cases, such as a father killing a son who was a respected citizen without good cause, might public opinion and social pressure lead to consequences. A wife had very little recourse against a tyrannical husband. The children of a divorced couple faced a particularly brutal reality. Roman law was unequivocal. Children belonged to the father's lineage. In a divorce, custody was never in question. The children stayed with the father. A mother who was cast out of her marital home was also cast out of her children's daily lives. She had no visitation rights. She might see them at family events, but she was no longer their primary caregiver or a part of their household. Let us look at the financial life of a typical Roman matron. Even if she was not independently wealthy, as the manager of the household, she controlled a significant budget. She would handle the dimensum, the daily or monthly allowance for household expenses. She would oversee purchases at the market, manage the household accounts, and be responsible for the family's domestic assets. This gave her considerable practical power and required a high degree of numeracy and organizational skill. The very word for family, familia, did not originally mean a loving unit of parents and children. It referred to the property of a household, including the slaves, under the control of a single man. The good death was an important concept for the Roman elite, and a wife played a key role in it. When a man was on his deathbed, he was expected to face his end with stoic courage and dignity. His family would gather around him. It was the duty of his wife and his closest relative to catch his last breath with a kiss, a symbolic gesture of capturing his spirit. After his death, she would lead the mourning, a public and often highly ritualized performance of grief. The ideal of friendship between a husband and wife, while not the foundation of marriage, was a celebrated ideal. Aulus Gellius, a writer from the 2nd century AD, tells a story about the philosopher Secundus, who, when asked, "What is a wife?" answered, "A complementary person, a partner in prosperity and adversity." This sentiment reflects the Stoic ideal of marriage as a partnership of souls. Let us consider the impact of military service on marriage from the wife's perspective. When a senator or governor was sent to a province for several years, his wife often faced a difficult choice. She could accompany him, leaving her home and support network in Rome to live in a foreign land, often in a dangerous frontier region. Or she could stay behind, managing the family's affairs and facing a long separation from her husband. The Roman concept of family was not limited to the nuclear family. The domus included not just the husband, wife, and children, but also a host of other relatives, unmarried sisters, widowed mothers, and dependent cousins. It was a multi-generational and extended household, and most importantly, it included the slaves. The familia legally meant everyone and everything under the power of the paterfamilias. This created a complex and crowded social environment. The legal age of consent for marriage, 12 for a girl, is a fact that we must confront in all its brutal reality. Roman society did not have a concept of childhood that extended into the teenage years as we do. A girl was considered to have reached womanhood once she was physically capable of bearing children. Her transition from girl to wife was swift and abrupt. There was no adolescence, no period of gradual transition. The Roman fear of a domineering wife was a common theme in satire and moralizing texts. A man who was seen to be controlled by his wife was an object of ridicule, a man who had failed in his fundamental duty to be the head of his household. This anxiety reveals a deep-seated fear of female power. If a woman had her own wealth, a strong personality, or a sharp intellect, she could threaten the established patriarchal order. The henpecked husband was a stock character in Roman comedy. Let's delve deeper into the conferitio, the most ancient and solemn form of Roman wedding ceremony, reserved for the patrician class. This ritual was not just a wedding, it was a sacred religious act, presided over by the high priests, the Pontifex Maximus and the Flamen Diales. The bride and groom sat on two chairs joined together and covered with the skin of a sacrificed sheep. The role of female friends in a Roman woman's life was a vital, if often unrecorded, source of support. While her public life was restricted, a matron would have a network of female friends and relatives. They would meet during social calls, at the baths, or at religious festivals. In this private sorority, they could share the experiences of marriage and motherhood, offer advice, and provide emotional comfort. The practice of exposing infants, the expositio, remains one of the most shocking aspects of Roman family life. While the paterfamilias held the legal right, the decision was often driven by brutal pragmatism. A deformed child was seen as a bad omen, and a drain on resources. A daughter might be exposed if the family already had daughters and desperately needed a son to continue the line, or if they simply could not afford another dowry. This was not necessarily seen as murder. The Roman view of romantic passion, or amor, was deeply ambivalent. They recognized its power. The story of Antony and Cleopatra was a cautionary tale on a grand scale, a story of how a great Roman general could be brought to ruin by his passion for a foreign queen, neglecting his duty to Rome. Amor was seen as a form of madness, a sickness that clouded judgment and led to irrational behavior. It was the antithesis of the Roman ideal of rational self-control. This is the brutal paradox we will explore. A civilization that gave us law, engineering, and philosophy, yet built its society on a family structure that could feel, to our modern minds, profoundly unloving and severe. Let's consider the end of the Roman wedding day. After the bride was led to the lectus genialis, the groom's friends and family would remain outside the door, singing bawdy and teasing songs, known as fescennine verses. These songs were often crude and filled with sexual jokes, intended to ward off evil spirits and to encourage the couple's fertility. This ritual is a fascinating blend of public and private. The concept of a wife's obedience, obsequium, was a cornerstone of a successful Roman marriage. This was not necessarily a cowering, servile obedience, but rather a willing and graceful deference to her husband's authority as the head of the household. It was seen as a key component of marital harmony, concordia. A wife showed her obsequium by managing the household according to his wishes, by being modest in her public behavior, and by supporting his goals. The brutal reality of slavery permeated every aspect of a Roman marriage, especially in a wealthy household. The presence of slaves created a complex and often toxic emotional environment. A husband's sexual access to his female slaves was an accepted fact of life, a constant, institutionalized infidelity that a wife was expected to ignore. A wife's interactions with male slaves were fraught with suspicion. Any perceived familiarity could be grounds for accusations of adultery. Let's look at the material culture of the Roman bride. The dowry was not just money. It often included a trousseau of personal items, clothing, jewelry, and perhaps fine furniture. These objects were a tangible display of her family's wealth and status. The jewelry, in particular, was significant. Bracelets, necklaces, and earrings were not just for adornment. They were a form of portable wealth. The Roman legal system's evolution on marriage reflects the society's changing needs. The old cum manu marriage, which completely absorbed the wife into the husband's family, was perfect for the early republic, a small, agrarian city-state that valued absolute family unity. As Rome grew into a vast, complex empire with enormous private fortunes, this system became unwieldy. The role of the census in Roman life had a direct impact on marriage and family. Every 5 years, the head of a household had to register his family with the censors. He had to declare his wife, his children, and his property. This act of registration was what officially established a family's status and citizenship. It was a formal declaration to the state. The census reinforced the power of the paterfamilias as the sole representative of his family in the eyes of the state. Consider the emotional world of a Roman widow. If she was praised for not remarrying, she was expected to live a life of perpetual mourning. This meant wearing dark clothes, avoiding social gatherings, and devoting herself to her late husband's memory. This was a life of social invisibility. If she was young and pressured to remarry, she faced a different set of challenges. She had to navigate the courtship process again, this time as a woman with a past. The architecture of a large Roman villa often included separate quarters for the husband and wife. While they shared a marital bedroom, they might also have their own separate studies or reception rooms. This reflects the reality of their separate lives and responsibilities. The husband's study, the tablinum, was his office, where he conducted business and met with clients. The wife might have her own sitting room where she would receive her female friends and supervise the household's textile production. The Roman attitude towards divorce was notably unsentimental. There was no concept of irreconcilable differences or a no-fault divorce in the modern emotional sense. The reasons for divorce were often brutally practical. A wife's barrenness was a common cause. Her suspected or proven adultery was another. A man might divorce his wife simply because a more politically or financially advantageous match became available. The religious life of a Roman man and woman, even within the same household, was different. While the wife was the priestess of the domestic hearth, the husband was the family's link to the public, state religion. He would lead the family in celebrating the major public festivals. He would be the one to represent the family at the local temple. Most importantly, he was in charge of the ancestor cult. We must understand that for the Romans, marriage was not about personal fulfillment. It was the bedrock of the state, the institution that produced the citizens and soldiers who would conquer and rule the world. The brutal reality of love and marriage in Rome is, in the end, a story of an institution under pressure. It was pressured by the demands of the state for citizens and soldiers. It was pressured by the ambitions of families for wealth and status. It was pressured by the weight of tradition and the expectations of the ancestors. And it was pressured by the fundamental human desires for love, companionship, and personal happiness that often ran counter to the system's goals. The physical act of childbirth, as described in Roman medical texts, was seen as a battle. Soranus, the gynecologist, gives detailed instructions for the midwife, outlining the ideal birthing chair, the use of warm compresses, and the methods for assisting in a difficult birth. His tone is clinical, but it cannot hide the terror and danger of the event. The emotional impact of high infant mortality on a Roman family is difficult for us to fully comprehend. To lose one child is a tragedy. To lose multiple children was a common experience. How did Roman parents cope with this recurring grief? Some scholars have argued for a degree of emotional detachment, a defense mechanism against inevitable pain. However, the evidence from tombstones for children powerfully refutes this. Epitaphs for children are often the most personal and heartbreaking. The legal process of making a will, or testamentum, was a final and powerful exercise of the paterfamilias' authority. In his will, he would formally name his heir or heirs, ensuring the orderly transfer of his property and the continuation of his lineage. He could also use the will to leave legacies to his wife and other relatives, or to reward loyal friends and even slaves, whom he might free in his will. Let's consider the role of art in the Roman home. The walls of a wealthy Roman's house were often decorated with elaborate frescoes. These paintings were not just for decoration. They were a statement about the family's culture and values. Mythological scenes were popular, often depicting stories that reinforced Roman virtues of piety, courage, or duty. Landscapes and garden scenes brought a sense of nature and tranquility into the urban home. The Roman concept of concubinage, concubinatus, offers a fascinating alternative to formal marriage, and it was not just for soldiers or men of different social classes. A man who was widowed or divorced might choose to take a concubine rather than remarry, especially if he already had heirs from his first marriage. This allowed him to have a stable, long-term companion without the legal and financial complications of a formal marriage and a new dowry. The education of a Roman girl, while limited, should not be entirely dismissed. In literate families, many girls were taught to read and write. This was a practical necessity for a future matron who would need to manage household accounts and correspond with her husband. Some elite women went much further, achieving a high level of literary and even philosophical education. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, was famed for her intellect and her refined Latin prose. The brutal reality of slavery meant that a Roman matron's relationship with her own children was often mediated by slaves. A wealthy infant would be handed over to a wet nurse, nutrix, for breastfeeding. As the child grew, their daily care and supervision would be in the hands of a trusted slave, the pedagogus. This meant that a slave, not the mother, was often the person who spent the most time with a child in their formative years. Let's examine the concept of the family council, concilium. While the paterfamilias had absolute legal power, A wise one would not make major decisions in a vacuum. On important matters such as arranging a marriage or punishing a wayward child, he would often call a council of his senior male relatives and close friends. He would present the issue, listen to their advice, and then make his decision. The Roman legal system's approach to incestuous marriage was very strict, at least in theory. Marriage between close relatives, such as a brother and sister or an uncle and niece, was strictly forbidden and considered a heinous crime against divine and human law. This was a core principle for maintaining social order. The one major, glaring exception was the case of the Emperor Claudius, who wished to marry his niece, Agrippina the Younger. We will look into the shadows of the Roman household, into the spaces where private lives were lived, and where the laws of the heart often clashed with the unyielding laws of the state and the family. The bride's procession through the streets was a public spectacle, a joyful performance. But beneath the songs and scattered nuts was the solemn reality of a transfer of power and property. The daily routine of a Roman matron was one of constant, rhythmic duty. Her day would begin at dawn. After a simple breakfast, her first task would be to meet with the household steward and assign the day's tasks to the slaves. She would then spend time at her loom, the symbolic center of her work. She might receive social calls from other matrons or attend to her children's lessons. The concept of honor for a Roman woman was almost entirely defensive. For a man, honor dignitas was something that could be actively won on the battlefield or in the law courts. It was about achievement. For a woman, honor pudicitia was something that she was born with and had to protect. It could not be won, only lost. This fundamental difference is key to understanding the gender dynamics of Roman society. The role of a grandmother, or avia, could be one of significant influence in the Roman family. As the matriarch of the family, a respected grandmother often commanded great deference, even from her adult sons. She was the living repository of the family's history and traditions. She could play a key role in the upbringing of her grandchildren, offering advice and support to her daughter or daughter-in-law. The Roman view of cosmetics and beauty rituals reveals their complex attitude towards female appearance. Ovid wrote a whole poem on cosmetics, the Medicamina Faciae Feminae, giving recipes for face creams and beauty treatments. This shows that the pursuit of beauty was an accepted part of a woman's life. Archaeologists have found small pots of makeup, ivory combs, and elaborate mirrors in women's graves. However, this was always balanced by the moralists' condemnation of excess. The financial implications of widowhood were a major source of anxiety. If a woman was in a cum manu marriage, she was legally her husband's heir, often inheriting alongside her own children. This could give her some security. In the more common sine manu marriage, she was not her husband's legal heir, but she was entitled to the return of her full dowry. If her husband left her a legacy in his will, she could be very wealthy. Let's consider the brutal reality of a mixed status relationship. What happened when a freeborn citizen fell in love with a slave? Marriage was legally impossible. Any children they had would take the status of the mother. If she was a slave, the children would be born slaves, the property of her owner. This was a source of immense personal tragedy. A citizen father would see his own biological children born into servitude with no legal rights to him. The Roman dinner party, the convivium, was not just a meal. It was a highly structured social ritual that reinforced the patriarchal order. The host, the dominus, presided over the event. He decided the seating arrangement, which was based on a strict hierarchy of status. He directed the conversation and the entertainment. His wife, the matrona, was present as a co-hostess, but she played a secondary role. The role of curses and magic in Roman domestic life is a dark but important aspect. People who felt wronged or powerless could resort to curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with curses against their enemies, which were then folded, pierced with a nail, and hidden in graves or wells. These tablets reveal a world of hidden hatreds and resentments. We find curses related to love and marriage, a jilted lover cursing their rival, or someone cursing a couple out of jealousy. The coming-of-age ceremony for a Roman boy when he donned the toga virilis, toga of manhood, around the age of 14 or 15, was a major family event that starkly contrasted with a girl's transition to adulthood. The boy was escorted by his father and a crowd of family and friends to the forum, the heart of public life. There, his name was formally added to the roll of citizens. The influence of the Roman army as a social institution had a profound effect on concepts of marriage and family. The army was a powerful engine of Romanization. A provincial man who served for 25 years was granted Roman citizenship for himself and his family upon discharge. This meant that his informal barracks marriage to a local woman could be legitimized, and his children would become Roman citizens. Her consent was legally required, but what did consent mean for a 13-year-old girl, guided by her father and the immense weight of tradition? It was a formality, a whisper in a storm of expectation. The simple act of a Roman woman leaving her house was fraught with social meaning. A respectable matron did not simply wander out on her own. She was expected to be accompanied by a slave or a companion. Her purpose for being out was scrutinized. Was she going to the market, to the baths, to visit a temple, or to see a female friend? These were acceptable reasons. To be seen out too often or in the wrong parts of town or at the wrong times could damage her reputation. Let's consider the emotional life of a Roman husband. While the system gave him immense power, it also placed on him immense burdens. He was responsible for the economic well-being and the social reputation of his entire family. A failure in business or a political misstep could bring ruin not just to himself, but to his wife, his children, and his dependents. He was expected to be the strong, stoic center of the household, suppressing his own fears and anxieties. The Roman view of romantic jealousy in a woman was not just that it was inappropriate. It was often seen as a sign of her own potential infidelity. The logic, as expressed by some Roman writers, was that a woman who was overly suspicious of her husband's activities was likely projecting her own guilty conscience onto him. This twisted logic put a woman in an impossible position. To complain about her husband's well-known affairs was to risk being accused of being unfaithful herself. The religious festival of the Matronalia, celebrated by married women on March 1st, was a rare day that honored the role of the wife. On this day, husbands were expected to give gifts to their wives, and women would go to the temple of Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth, to offer prayers. It was a day that celebrated the peace and harmony of the marital home. However, even this festival reinforced the traditional roles. It celebrated women as wives and mothers. The physical space of the Roman kitchen reveals much about the status of food preparation and the people who did it. The kitchen was usually a small, dark, and smoky room, often tucked away in a corner of the house. It was the undisputed domain of slaves. The matron would supervise and plan the menus, but the hard, hot work of cooking was done by her domestic staff. This separation of the mistress from the kitchen is significant. The Augustan poet Horace, in one of his odes, famously praised the simple life and the virtues of the traditional Roman family, contrasting it with the perceived corruption of his own time. He paints an idealized picture of the stern mother and the hardworking farmer-soldier. This kind of nostalgic poetry was very common. The Romans were constantly looking back to a mythical golden age of virtue. This tells us that even they were aware of the tensions and contradictions in their own society. In reflecting on the brutal reality of Roman love and marriage, we are confronted with a system of profound contradictions. It was an institution that legally erased a woman's identity in a cum manu marriage, yet also created, through the sine manu form, some of the most legally independent and propertied women in the ancient world. The legacy of the Roman family structure is woven deeply into the fabric of Western civilization. The very word family comes from their familia, the legal concept of the husband as the head of the household, the emphasis on legitimate heirs for the transfer of property, and the legal mechanisms of the dowry all found their way into the legal codes of medieval and modern Europe. The Church, while transforming marriage into a sacrament, absorbed the patriarchal hierarchy of the Roman model. Perhaps the most brutal reality we must accept is the sheer lack of privacy in a Roman marriage. The couple lived in a house teeming with slaves who were silent observers of their every move. Their marital life was a matter of public interest and gossip. The state, through the census and laws like those of Augustus, felt it had the right to intervene in their procreative life. The wider family, through the concilium, had a say in their major decisions. Marriage was not a private affair between two individuals. The story of Roman marriage is also a powerful lesson in historical empathy. It is easy to judge the past by the standards of the present, to view the Romans as cruel and unfeeling. But to do so is to flatten their experience and to ignore the context of their world. They lived in a time of high mortality, constant warfare, and profound social hierarchy. Their system, for all its brutality, was a response to the challenges of their reality. The law held a man's life as his own, but a woman's life was always in relation to a man, first her father, then her husband. She was a daughter of one, then a wife of another. Let us return to the tender words on a tombstone. One from a husband reads, "She was my consolation in all my sorrows." Another from a wife describes her late husband as her sweetest hope in life. These small fragments of emotion, preserved in stone, are our most direct connection to the love that existed within the brutal Roman system. The physical symbols of Roman marriage, the iron ring, the woolen girdle, the flame-colored veil, the keys to the household, were all imbued with a heavy, serious meaning. They were not symbols of romance, but of contract, duty, and transition of power. The bride was ritually captured, carried over the threshold, and handed the elements of fire and water. Every gesture and every object reinforced her new role as a subordinate but essential part of a new household. Ultimately, the most significant difference between the Roman view of marriage and our own lies in the concept of the individual. In the modern West, we see marriage as a path to individual fulfillment and happiness. It is a choice made by two autonomous individuals for their mutual benefit. For the Romans, the individual was always subordinate to the collective. The family, the lineage, and the state were what mattered. Stories of women who defied the system, though rare, are a crucial part of this narrative. Women like Hortensia, who led a protest of Roman matrons against a special tax, or Sulpicia, who wrote poems about her forbidden love, show that the Roman female spirit was not entirely crushed by the weight of tradition. The powerful imperial women like Livia and Agrippina, for all their ruthlessness, demonstrated that women could achieve immense power by mastering the informal and secret corridors of influence. As we leave the ancient Roman world, the image that remains is one of stark, sun-bleached stone and deep, cool shadows. The stone represents the unyielding structure of Roman law and tradition, rigid, powerful, and enduring. It is the world of the paterfamilias, of duty of the state. But in the shadows, life happened. So what can we take away from this journey into the heart of the Roman family? We see a reflection, however distorted, of the enduring tensions that still exist in our own discussions about love and marriage. The conflict between individual desire and social expectation, the relationship between love and money, the challenges of parenthood, and the quest for a partnership of equals. These are not new conversations. Imagine the quiet moments of a Roman matron's day. After supervising the slaves and instructing the children, did she stare at her reflection and wonder about the girl she once was, before she became a wife? The brutal truth is that a woman's value was intrinsically tied to her fertility and her chastity. These were her currencies, and they were constantly scrutinized by her husband, her family, and her society. A barren wife could be easily and justifiably divorced. Her inability to produce an heir was not seen as a shared sorrow, but as her personal failure to fulfill the core purpose of the marriage contract. Even in death, the roles were defined. A man might be mourned as a great statesman or soldier. A woman was praised on her tombstone for being chaste, obedient, a good mother, a keeper of the home. The poetry of Catullus and Ovid speaks of passionate, often illicit, love. But these were affairs of the elite, fleeting romances outside the rigid confines of marriage, and they often ended in scandal and heartbreak. Let us not mistake the exception for the rule. For the vast majority of Romans, marriage was a practical, social, and economic necessity, a world away from the torrid passions of lyric poetry. The dowry was her contribution, but it was often a gilded cage. It gave her some protection in case of divorce, but it also represented the financial stake her family had in the success of the union. Imagine a promise not whispered between two lovers but declared between two fathers, a contract sealed not with a kiss, but with the cold, hard weight of a dowry, a transaction of property and bloodlines. To be a widow was to enter a dangerous limbo. Young widows were pressured to remarry quickly, to once again become useful to the state and a family by producing more legitimate children. Think of the political marriages of the late Republic. Julia, daughter of Caesar, married to his rival Pompey to seal an alliance. Her heart was a political pawn, her happiness irrelevant to the needs of great men. The goddess Juno was the protector of marriage, a symbol of the faithful, enduring wife. Yet even her mythology is filled with the stories of her husband Jupiter's endless infidelities. The divine mirrored the mortal. The law was a man's shield and his sword. He could accuse his wife of adultery and see her exiled or killed. She held no such reciprocal power over him. The scales of justice were deliberately unbalanced. A woman's friendships, her conversations, even her glances could be misinterpreted or used against her. She lived in a state of constant surveillance, where her reputation was her most fragile and vital asset. The concept of marital rape did not exist. A wife's body was considered the property of her husband for the purpose of procreation. The law simply had no framework to comprehend her lack of consent. The ideal was the univira, the woman who had only one husband in her lifetime. This was held up as the pinnacle of female virtue, a testament to her loyalty and purity, even after her husband's death. But reality often intruded. With high mortality rates, remarriage was common and necessary. The ideal of the univira was a beautiful story, but one that life and death frequently rewrote. The power of a mother over her sons, the famed influence of the Roman matron, was real. But it was a soft power, exercised through influence and persuasion, never through direct legal authority. This entire system was designed for one purpose: stability. The stability of the family line, the clarity of inheritance, and the social order of the Roman state. Individual happiness was a distant concern. Think of a young girl, barely a woman, her hand placed in that of a man she barely knows. Her identity, her very legal existence, is about to be transferred, like a deed, from one master to another. The wedding torch, a symbol of light and hope, also cast long, dark shadows. It illuminated the path to a new home, but also the stark realities and duties that awaited the bride within its walls. We will piece together this story from legal texts, from letters, from tombstones, and from the ruins of homes. We will listen for the whispers of the people who lived these brutal and complex lives. The story of Roman marriage is not a romance. It is a story of power, property, and politics, played out in the most intimate theater of human life. It is a story of survival within a rigid system. The father of the family held the keys not only to the home, but to the lives and deaths of those within it. His authority was a microcosm of the emperor's authority over the state. Imagine the emotional landscape of such a world where duty is prized above love, where passion is suspicious, and where a woman's life is defined by the men she is bound to. The weight of ancestors, the expectations of the future, the unyielding gaze of the law. This was the context for every Roman marriage, a far cry from our modern ideals of a partnership of equals. Even the act of naming a child reinforced the structure. A daughter often took the feminine form of her father's family name, a constant reminder of her origin and her place in the patriarchal line. She was expected to be grave, dignified, and modest. Laughter that was too loud, a gesture that was too free. These could be seen as signs of a flawed character, a threat to the family's honor. We must strip away the romance of Hollywood epics and see the institution for what it was. The central pillar of Roman society, built with stones of law and cemented with the mortar of duty. And yet, through the cracks in this brutal facade, we can find evidence of genuine human connection, of deep affection, and of quiet resilience. These moments make the story all the more compelling. The veil she wears is not just a symbol of modesty, but a shroud over her former life. When she crosses the threshold of her new home, she is reborn, but into a world of duty, not necessarily desire. So let us begin our journey, not into the Senate or the Coliseum, but into the heart of the Roman Domus, to understand the lived, and often brutal, reality of love and marriage in ancient Rome. To truly comprehend the brutal reality of Roman marriage, we must begin not with a bride and groom, but with a single, terrifyingly powerful figure, the Paterfamilias, the father of the family. This was the oldest living male in a bloodline, and Roman law granted him a power that is almost unthinkable to us today. It was called patria potestas, the power of the father. This was not merely the authority of a household head, it was the power of absolute ownership. Narration lipsa. So what did this mean for a young Roman girl approaching marriageable age? Her life was not her own to plan. Betrothals could be arranged by the paterfamilias when she was as young as 7, though the legal age for marriage was 12. These were not romantic engagements. They were strategic moves on a familial chessboard. A daughter from a powerful senatorial family might be promised to the son of another to consolidate political power. Let's delve into the legal mechanics of how a woman was transferred from one family to another. There were two primary forms of Roman marriage, and they had profound implications for a woman's life. The older, more traditional form was marriage cum manu, meaning with hand. In this type of marriage, the wife passed from the potestas, or power, of her father into the hand, manus, of her husband. Legally, she became her husband's daughter. By the time of the late Republic and the Empire, however, a different form of marriage had become far more common, marriage sine manu, meaning without hand. This represented a significant, though not total, shift in a woman's status. In a sine manu marriage, the wife did not pass into her husband's legal control. She legally remained under the potestas of her own paterfamilias as long as he lived. When her father died, she could, remarkably, become legally independent or sui iuris. The wedding day itself was a carefully choreographed ritual, a public performance rich with symbolism that reinforced the bride's transition. On the eve of her wedding, a girl would dedicate her childhood toys and her toga praetexta, the purple-bordered toga of a child, to the household gods, signifying the end of her girlhood. The procession to the groom's house was a key part of the ceremony. The bride was escorted by torchbearers and flute players, with crowds scattering nuts, a symbol of fertility. Upon arrival, she would anoint the doorposts of her new home with oil and wool, symbols of her future domestic duties. She was then ceremoniously carried over the threshold by her husband or his attendants. Once the ceremonies were over, the Roman wife, now a matrona, stepped into her defined role. Her world was the domus, the household. Her primary task, above all else, was the production of legitimate children to continue her husband's lineage. This was not a private matter but a public duty. The Augustan moral legislation of the 1st century BC even penalized the unmarried and the childless among the elite, offering rewards and privileges to those who produced multiple children. But what did this ideal of the Roman matrona mean in reality? It meant a life of immense responsibility but limited freedom. While a wealthy matron had considerable power within her household, her life outside it was circumscribed. She could not vote, hold political office, or plead in a court of law. Her public appearances were expected to be modest and accompanied. The rings they exchange are not symbols of endless love, but of a binding agreement. An iron circle, unforgiving and strong, representing a chain of obligation that will define the rest of her days. The contrast between the expected fidelity of a wife and the freedom of a husband is one of the most brutal aspects of Roman marriage. For a woman, chastity pudicitia was her paramount virtue. Adultery on her part was a heinous crime, not just against her husband, but against the state. Why? Because it threatened the certainty of the bloodline. An adulterous wife could introduce an illegitimate child into the family, jeopardizing the entire system of inheritance and property rights. Now let's look at the other side of the marital bed. For a Roman husband, the rules were entirely different. His fidelity was not a matter of law or even, in most cases, of social expectation. A man was free to have sexual relationships outside of marriage, provided it was with women of a lower social status, such as slaves, freedwomen, or prostitutes. These relationships were not considered adultery in the legal sense. Given this rigid transactional framework, we are left with the great question: did the Romans fall in love? Did genuine affection exist within these marriages? The answer is a quiet but definite yes. While love was not the basis for marriage, it could certainly grow within it. We find evidence of this in the most personal of places: letters and epitaphs. The letters of Pliny the Younger to his young wife, Calpurnia, are filled with tenderness. Funerary inscriptions provide some of the most moving evidence for love in Roman marriage. On tombstones across the empire, husbands and wives left final testaments to their shared lives. We read epitaphs dedicated to a Uxor Carissima, dearest wife, or a Caniunx Dulcissima, sweetest spouse. One famous inscription from a man named Lucius Aurelius Hermia for his deceased wife reads, "She who was my partner in life, of a rare character, departed from me on her 25th birthday." However, we must be careful not to romanticize these findings. While love clearly existed, it did so within the system, not outside of it. The very epitaphs that speak of love often do so by praising the wife for her traditional virtues, her chastity, her modesty, her skill at weaving, her obedience. It seems that love was often intertwined with a woman's successful performance of her wifely duties. She was loved, perhaps, because she was a good Roman matron. Let's turn to the subject of divorce. In the world of Roman marriage, ending a union could be surprisingly simple, at least from a legal standpoint. During the late Republic and Empire, in the common sign manu marriages, divorce was essentially a private act. There was no need for a court ruling or legal proceedings. While the legal process of divorce was simple, the consequences, especially for the woman, could be brutal. For a man, divorce might be a strategic political or personal reset. For a woman, it could mean the complete upheaval of her life. She would be forced to leave the home she had managed, and most painfully, leave her children behind. Children, by law, always remained with the father's family, as they belonged to his bloodline. A divorced woman had no custody rights whatsoever. The social consequences of divorce for a woman were also severe. While divorce itself was not necessarily shameful, a woman's market value for remarriage could be diminished. She was no longer a young virgin, and she might be viewed with suspicion. Her reputation was paramount. If the divorce was due to any hint of scandal or misconduct on her part, she could be socially ostracized. Widowhood was another brutal reality of Roman life, given the short life expectancies of the era. A man who lost his wife was free to remarry as he pleased, and often did so quickly to secure another dowry and the chance for more children. For a widow, the situation was far more complex. In the early Republic, the ideal of the univira, the one-man woman, was deeply revered. However, this ideal of the perpetual widow clashed with the state's practical needs, particularly the need for legitimate children. By the time of Emperor Augustus, the state's interest in procreation overrode the old ideal. Augustus's moral legislation actively penalized widows of a certain age who refused to remarry within a set period. The state wanted these women's reproductive capacity put back to use for the good of Rome. This put widows in a difficult position. The home, the domus, is her new kingdom, but she is its manager, not its monarch. The true king is her husband, and before him, his father, a figure vested with the power of gods over his own kin. For a widow, especially one who was still young, her future was once again largely in the hands of men. Her father or male guardian would likely arrange her next marriage, again with family strategy in mind. If she was legally independent, sui iuris, and wealthy, she had more autonomy, but she also became a target for fortune hunters. A rich widow was a prize, and she would have faced immense pressure from potential suitors and her own family. Now let us turn to the purpose of it all, the children. In the Roman mind, the primary, overriding purpose of marriage was procreation. But this was not about the joy of parenthood as we might see it. It was about the solemn duty of continuing a lineage. An heir was needed to inherit the family property, to carry on the family name, nomen, and crucially, to perform the sacred rites for the ancestors. The brutal reality of childhood in Rome was also shaped by staggering mortality rates. It's estimated that as many as 1 in 4 infants died within their first year, and perhaps half of all children did not survive to the age of 10. Disease, malnutrition, and poor sanitation were rampant. This meant that parents lived with the constant presence of death. They would have seen multiple children die before reaching adulthood. The father's role in child-rearing was primarily one of discipline and education for his sons. The paterfamilias was the ultimate authority, and his relationship with his children was often formal and distant, based on respect rather than overt affection. It was the mother's domain to oversee the early years of a child's life. She was their first teacher, responsible for instilling in them the morals and values of a good Roman. For her sons, she would prepare them for a life in the public sphere. The education of Roman children clearly reflected their prescribed gender roles. A boy from an elite family would be handed over to a tutor around the age of 7. He would learn to read and write in Latin and Greek, and study rhetoric, philosophy, and law. His entire education was designed to prepare him for a public life, as a lawyer, a politician, a general. A girl's education, on the other hand, was almost entirely domestic. The concept of domestic violence is a dark and difficult subject in any historical context. In Rome, the law was chillingly clear. The paterfamilias had, for much of Roman history, the legal right of life and death over his family. While this right was rarely exercised in later periods, the power dynamic it established is undeniable. A husband held immense authority over his wife. The law permitted a husband to use physical chastisement against his wife for certain perceived offenses. While physical violence was a reality, we should also consider the psychological brutality inherent in the system. Imagine the daily life of a woman who knows her value is contingent on her fertility, whose every action is judged against an unforgiving standard of chastity, and who can be dismissed and separated from her children at her husband's whim. It's important to ask if things changed over the vast expanse of Roman history, which lasted over 1,000 years. The answer is yes, but slowly and unevenly. The shift from the restrictive cum manu marriage to the more flexible sine manu form was a significant legal evolution, granting women more economic power and independence. The influence of women in Roman politics is a fascinating paradox. Legally, they had no direct power. They could not vote, stand for election, or serve in the Senate. Yet behind the scenes, the wives, mothers, and daughters of powerful men could wield enormous influence. Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus, is a prime example. She was his trusted advisor for over 50 years, a shrewd political operator who helped manage the vast network of imperial patronage and succession. Let's consider the lives of women outside the elite. The vast majority of people in the Roman Empire were not wealthy aristocrats. They were farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, and the urban poor. For these families, marriage was less about political alliances and more about basic survival. A wife was an essential partner in the family's economic enterprise. A farmer's wife would work in the fields. A baker's wife would help in the shop. Her labor was crucial. Her primary duty is etched in stone and spoken in prayers: to bear legitimate children, heirs to a name, to property, to a legacy she is tasked to perpetuate, but never truly possess as her own. And what about those at the very bottom of the social ladder, the enslaved? For the millions of slaves in the Roman world, marriage as a legal concept did not exist. Slaves were property. They could not legally marry. They could, however, form relationships and families, which were known as contubernium. These unions were not recognized or protected by law. A master could separate a slave couple at any time, selling the husband to one owner and the wife to another. The Roman view of same-sex relationships adds another layer to our understanding of their society's views on love and partnership. For men, the crucial factor was not the gender of their partner, but the role they played. A freeborn Roman man could have a sexual relationship with another male without social stigma, as long as he took the dominant, active role. The relationship was seen as an expression of his virility. The dowry system deserves a closer look, as it was the financial engine of Roman marriage. The dues, or dowry, was the property that a bride's family transferred to the groom or his paterfamilias upon marriage. It was intended to contribute to the expenses of the new household. The size of the dowry was a major factor in determining a girl's marriage prospects. A large dowry could help a girl from a lower status family marry into a more prestigious one. The role of religion and superstition in marriage was pervasive. The goddess Juno Pernuba was the special patroness of marriage, and sacrifices would be made to her to ensure a fruitful and harmonious union. The wedding date itself was carefully chosen. Certain days, like the entire month of May and the kalends, nones, and ides of each month, were considered unlucky for weddings. Let's reflect on the physical space of the marriage. The Roman house, or domus. The layout of a wealthy Roman's house reflects the social dynamics we've been discussing. It was divided into public and private areas. The atrium was the semi-public reception hall where the master of the house, the dominus, would receive his clients and conduct business. This was his space. The more private areas, the peristylium or garden courtyard and the surrounding rooms, cubicula, were the domain of the family. The Roman concept of pietas is crucial to understanding the emotional landscape of marriage. Pietas is often translated as piety or duty, but it's a much broader concept. It meant a selfless sense of duty toward one's family, one's ancestors, one's country, and the gods. The great Roman hero, Aeneas, is defined by his pietas. He leaves his beloved Dido in Carthage not because he wants to, but because it is his duty to found Rome. This was the ideal that Romans were raised on. What about the end of life? If a marriage endured into old age, it could become a partnership of deep respect and companionship. The funerary monument of the baker Eurysaces and his wife Adistia in Rome provides a touching glimpse. The monument, shaped like a giant oven, celebrates his profession, but he chose to be buried with his wife, and the inscription praises her as a good and loyal partner. We must also touch on the exceptions that prove the rule. The Roman world was not a monolith, and there were always individuals who pushed against the boundaries. The poetry of Sulpicia, the only female Roman poet whose work survives in any significant quantity, gives us a rare female voice on love. She writes not of wifely duty, but of a passionate, all-consuming love for a man named Cerinthus. She chafes against the control of her guardian and wishes to be with her lover. The legacy of Roman marriage law is long and complex. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, many of the old pagan traditions were swept away, but the legal foundations remained influential. The Church introduced the idea of marriage as a holy sacrament, an unbreakable bond in the eyes of God, which made divorce much more difficult than it had been under Roman civil law. So in conclusion, how do we judge the Roman institution of marriage? It's tempting to apply our own modern values and condemn it as an oppressive, unloving system. And in many ways, by our standards, it was. It was fundamentally unequal. It treated women as legal minors for much of their lives. It prioritized property and lineage over individual happiness. It was, in a word, brutal. But to do only that is to miss the point. The ancestral masks, the imagines, watch from the walls of the atrium. They are a constant, silent reminder of the lineage she has joined, and the immense pressure to be worthy of it, to not bring shame upon it. The most powerful lesson from studying Roman marriage is the sheer complexity of human relationships in any era. It was a system of stark contradictions. It was a legal contract that could also be the setting for profound love. It was a tool of political power that could also foster genuine companionship. It was a cage of duty that could also be a source of immense pride and purpose for a Roman matron. To truly grasp the world of the Roman bride, let's linger on the concept of age. The legal minimum age for a girl to marry was 12, and for a boy, 14. However, for girls in the elite classes, marriage around the age of 13 or 14 was common. Imagine a girl who has just left her childhood behind, plunged into the physical and emotional responsibilities of marriage and the immense pressure of running a household. The wedding night itself held a particular kind of brutal reality. The untying of the knot of Hercules by the groom was a deeply symbolic moment. This knot, difficult to unfasten, symbolized the bride's virginity and the groom's rightful claim to it. The consummation of the marriage was not just an expected outcome, it was a necessary component to legitimize the union. The influence of Greek culture on Roman perceptions of love and marriage is also worth considering. While the Romans prided themselves on their own traditions, they were heavily influenced by the Greeks, particularly in philosophy and literature. From the Greeks, they inherited an intellectual tradition that often separated love and marriage. Let's explore the idea of the good wife beyond the famous ideal of Cornelia. The tombstone of a woman named Claudia, dating from the 2nd century BC, provides a concise and powerful summary of the expected virtues. The epitaph reads, "Stranger, what I have to say is short. Stop and read it. This is the unbeautiful tomb of a beautiful woman. Her parents named her Claudia. She loved her husband with her whole heart. She bore 2 sons. She kept the house. She made wool. I have spoken." We have spoken of the Paterfamilias, but what happened when he died? His death was a transformative event for the entire family. His sons, no matter their age, were finally freed from his legal power and became sui iuris, legally independent heads of their own families. If he had a wife in a cum manu marriage, she would pass into the guardianship of his heir. If his daughters were unmarried, their guardianship would also pass to the heir. The Roman attitude towards beauty and adornment in a wife was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, poets celebrated female beauty, and archaeological finds show that Roman women used a wide array of cosmetics, perfumes, and elaborate hairstyles. Beauty was certainly appreciated. On the other hand, moralists and satirists frequently condemned excessive adornment as a sign of vanity, luxury, and moral laxity. The concept of honor was central to the Roman male identity, and this honor was inextricably linked to the conduct of his female relatives. A man's reputation, his dignitas, could be seriously damaged by the perceived misbehavior of his wife, daughter, or sister. This is another reason why female chastity was so rigorously policed. Let's consider the spaces where women could gather and exert some form of collective identity. While their public life was limited, the public baths provided a venue for social interaction. Though men and women often bathed at different times or in separate facilities, bathhouses were social hubs. Religious festivals also offered women a chance to participate in public life. The economic role of the matrona in a wealthy household should not be underestimated. While she could not engage in commerce herself, she was the manager of a complex economic unit. A large domus had dozens, sometimes hundreds of slaves. She was responsible for overseeing their work, managing supplies of food and textiles, keeping household accounts, and ensuring the smooth operation of the entire enterprise. This required intelligence, organization, and authority.